G'day and welcome to Aussie Mike's Bees. I'm Mike Allerton and this is the latest update from me about the Varroa incident in New South Wales. Today's date is the 17th of September and today I'll be going through the latest email that I got just a couple of days ago from the DPI and also touch on my experience of 6 days volunteering as the subject expert on the eradication program in the red zone up in the Newcastle region. So let's get into it. Now, first of all, I'm going to go through the email that I got from the DPI, beekeeper update. They've been really good in keeping us, or at least they've been keeping me very well informed, both directly through the DPI emails, but also through the Amateur Beekeepers Australia, of which I'm a member. The information has been great. So I would recommend everyone join the ABA to be better informed. That's my plug for the club. Okay, back to this email. So the beekeeper update on the 15th of September, so just a couple of days ago. And that's about the introduction there. There's a hotline to call if you discover Varroa, and there's also a link here to the plain English version of the emergency order number 28. Now, we've been called on to ramp up self-surveillance and they're going for alcohol wash now. I think they're pretty much convinced that alcohol washes are better than sugar shakes. So statewide surveillance will be strengthened to ensure the New South Wales beekeepers have greater flexibility to continue their operations throughout the Varroa mite emergency order, effective today, so effective on the 15th of September. The latest changes require beekeepers to alcohol wash a portion of their hives at least every 16 weeks and to report the results to the New South Wales Department of Primary Industry, the DPI, through this phone number, a 1-800 number, or easier I find is to do it online with that link. Beekeepers are no longer required to wash hives before they move. That's really interesting. Provided that the apiary proposed to be moved has been subjected to at least one wash under the new requirements. Okay, so you don't have to do it immediately now, but as long as you've washed it recently, then you're good to go. Now, incidentally, just to go back to that report, that's to report negative results too. So report the results of your test, positive or negative. Now, queen bee breeders, this could affect a lot of people. Additional changes to the emergency order effective today allow registered commercial beekeepers to move queen bees and escort bees or queen cells to any registered beekeeper within the blue emergency zone and to the purple surveillance emergency zone. This is really good news because up until now we couldn't get queens, if particularly as recreational beekeepers. If we needed queens to replace lost queens, or you're doing splits and so on, you wanted to buy good genetic stock, that wasn't available to us until this order. So this is great news. As they're saying, this is good news for commercial queen breeders who can now commence sales, sure, but it's good for us guys too. So they've got a bunch of rules to follow. They've got to have done the Tocal Varroa training and ensure their apiary from which they're harvesting their queens have been alcohol washed and obviously free of any Varroa. And they've got to keep records of that for at least 5 years. When moving queens and queen cells, registered commercial beekeepers must ensure the queen bee and escorts or queen cells are moved in a secure container that prevents them from coming into contact with any other bees. Logical. They've got to remain in the secure container until they arrive at the premises at which they will be placed into a hive. Sensible? The registered commercial beekeeper must make a record of the following and retain the record for at least 5 years. The location where the bee was bred, where the queen bee was bred, the date on which the movement occurred, and the details of the original and destination premises. Okay, that's all about queen bees. That's really, really good news for spring, when we really need these new queens. And for the commercial guys to get back into making a living. They've been doing it tough too. Now, reimbursement. Registered commercial and recreational beekeepers whose hives have been euthanised as a part of the response are eligible for reimbursement. We've talked about this before. I'm not going to touch on the commercial side. That's the industry is funding that, and they're being reimbursed, a completely different thing. But due to the ABA's lobbying, recreational beekeepers are getting reimbursed as well. As I've said before, the level of reimbursement is $555 per euthanised hive, consisting of the brood chamber, base and lid. We'll go into this a little bit more. It does not necessarily include the super. So $550 for full hive disposal by the DPI, or $200 if you choose to keep all of the equipment. It'll be euthanised by the DPI teams, wrapped up, and it's got to stay wrapped until notified, and then you can unwrap it and clean up the mess. Personally, I don't know why you'd want to do that, unless you've got some Taj Mahal beehive that costs an absolute fortune. I would be inclined to take the $550, let them dispose of the mess and the brood chamber, and then you've got $550 to buy a new brood box. But your choice. It could be different for longlangs, for instance, or top bar hives, but even they're fairly simple and relatively inexpensive to rebuild. But that's your personal thing. Now, what I wanted to get onto here is flow hive supers. They're expensive. You can keep that. The roof, it's the pretty pitched roof that you get with the flow hive. You can keep that. When the DPI notifies you of your pending euthanizing program for your hive or hives, you've got that time to remove the super, harvest the honey, and you've got to wrap the equipment up. Once you've harvested and you've got empty frames, you've got to wrap that in plastic, preferably double plastic bag it, and keep it bee-proof for the next few weeks until notified. Well, you can do the same with the roof, and then just cut out a piece of plywood and put that as a temporary lid, because when the euthanizing teams come around, it's going to be easier for them to lift that lid and wrap it, and also you don't lose that, you'll keep it. So I hope that's good news. Now we'll continue with this. You've got to be eligible for it, and to be eligible for reimbursement, you must be a registered beekeeper with the DPI. Now, everyone who keeps bees in New South Wales are legally bound to register with the DPI anyway. Sure, there's been some people that were not aware of that and they've kept bees for years and years and not registered. I think everyone should know by now that they should be registered, and the DPI have had a moratorium on any repercussions if you've come forward. It doesn't matter how many hives you've got, how long you've had hives, all you had to do is come forward and register now. There is a fairly small fee for a 2-year registration, I think it is. Might be $50 or $60 or something. But that's not per hive, that's per beekeeper. So get in and do it. And this is part of the reason why. If you're not registered, you'll get nothing. Have honeybee colonies and hives and equipment destroyed as a direct result of the Varroa emergency response. Now, something to differentiate here. You're not to destroy your own hives. It's the DPI that comes in. That's the only way that standards can be maintained and biosecurity is applied properly. You might not wrap them up properly, you might not kill them properly, whereas these teams are trained and know what they're doing, and they're going to make sure that that Varroa and the viruses don't escape. As a part of the euthanasia program, authorised officers record evidence and the details of all hives and colonies impacted by the Varroa mite emergency response. The evidence recorded informs the Rural Assistance Authority, who is responsible for the payment of the reimbursement. Every site that is visited for destruction has an authorised officer. He is legally enabled to enter your premises. Those people thinking about government overreach and think that you can deny entry, you can't. You can try, and that authorised officer can then call in the police and they will enter your premises and the action will happen. That's just the way it is. That authorised officer will record that information, and that's the number of hives, the type of hives. You don't need to take any action until you are contacted by an authorised officer with the relevant information. Authorised officers will provide impacted beekeepers with details on how to apply for reimbursement, including a link to the application form, and that your well-being. That's for mental health. Okay, that's that email. That's all I'm going to cover here. The other thing I wanted to talk about was my experience as a volunteer up Newcastle Red Zone as the subject matter expert, they called it, which basically means beekeeper. The eradication teams consisted of half a dozen people, sometimes more, consisting of an authorised officer, the subject matter expert, and various people from organisations like the Rural Fire Service Volunteers, permanent Rural Fire Service employees, New South Wales government employees consisting, and ACT as well, consisting of parks and wildlife rangers and the like. And government vehicles were used to transport all of the equipment. Everyone was inducted in biosecurity protocols and how to go about the process. I did 6 nights. We eradicated quite a few hundred hives in that time. Incidentally, that included the DPI's hives. The DPI at Tocal is well within the red zone. So if anyone was thinking they're getting out of it, they're not. I personally eradicated about 100 of their hives on a couple of nights. So it ranged from people with 1 hive to people with, there was one with 165 hives at one location. And this is where I found some misinformation or some misunderstanding of the information. When we turned up on site to do the daytime inspection to see if there are any safety issues and to work out the best approach for each property, often we found the likes of flow hives full. There was one we went to where they had, well, I think it was 3 hives with 2 flow supers on each one, and they were being destroyed. Now, destruction was pouring half a litre of petrol from the top, like a soaked rag, and then the remainder of the petrol turned over, and it's the fumes that kill the bees. But also that goes into the plastic. Let me say, anyone who's still waiting for that phone call to say that they've got to be eradicated in the next 48 hours, you can legally harvest the honey and remove the supers. So do that. And as I said earlier, remove your flow hive roof too. That's a valuable part of your equipment. They've got to be sealed up at the end of it and stored in a bee-proof place in that bee-proof plastic bag, preferably 2, and at least you're keeping it. You might not be able to keep bees for 3 years or more, possibly, but at least you're keeping the most valuable part of your hive. Now, what was it like having to go and kill people's hives? It wasn't good. It's not a good experience, but it's something that has to be done. And we faced with some owners that were completely distraught. But I've got to say that was in the minority. And the vast majority of the people that we met with were actually very positive and confident that the DPI is doing the right thing and that we'll be successful. They're certainly hopeful that we'll be successful in eradicating the Varroa from our shores before. This isn't their first rodeo. There was the outbreak in Townsville of Varroa jacobsoni, and they eradicated it. It's gone. They've been declared free of the Varroa mite up there, and this is the goal down here. Some of the questions I've seen in the forums online is they're eradicating my hive even though it tested negative. Let's get this into perspective. We take 300 bees out of 20,000 or 30,000 and you didn't see Varroa in that test. That doesn't mean that it doesn't have Varroa. But we've still got to put it in the perspective that you're in the red zone because at the centre of that red zone there was a positive identification of Varroa. And bees fly up to 5 kilometres, and with drift they can fly further. So they're making that 10 kilometre zone to eradicate all the possible bees that Varroa can travel on. That's why, even though your hive might have been tested negative, that your hive is being destroyed. I'm sorry about it, it's horrible, and I thank you for your sacrifice in that regard, but that's for the greater good. Other people have said, what about the feral colonies, the ones in the trees? They're carrying it already and there's no way this operation is going to work. Well, as I've said before, that's what the baiting program's about. They're putting the baits in a grid pattern at least every 3 kilometres within the red zone. And what does that bait station mean? Well, first of all, they load up sugar syrup and leave that for several days at a time for the bees to get used to that being a good food source. And then an employee of the government, some of them contractors for the next 12 months, come around to that bait station, swap out the sugar syrup and put in a fipronil bait. Fipronil is a insecticide. It's used in products like ant rid. It's a product that doesn't kill on contact. It's taken back to the colony where, through sharing that food with the rest of her sisters, that forager will spread the poison and wipe out that colony. Now, what about harm to other honey eaters such as native bees and birds even, and anyone else that would be interested in that sugar syrup? Well, that fipronil bait will only be there for a few hours and the operator will be sitting there watching the station to make sure that that collateral damage does not happen. And after a few hours it'll be removed, so it'll be there in the peak feeding time of the day. Then it'll be removed and the sugar syrup returned and left for a few days. Then the baiting comes back for a few hours, and this will continue for the next 12 months. So will they get the feral bees? I think so. Will they get unregistered, unreported hives that are hidden somewhere? Yeah, they will. There's also monitoring. So people will be keeping an eye out for bees. And in the red zone, there should not be a single honeybee, European honeybee, anywhere after this eradication program. And if they are spotted, spotters can do beelining and trace where they come from. But the confidence is very high that the combination of eradication plus baiting over a 12-month period and then reassessment and it could be reassessed to say we need to continue the baiting or not. We'll see. The combination will wipe it out. I'm very confident of it, and while I've worked with the DPI up there doing the program, I was very impressed by the professionalism of everyone. Not just the staff there, but also the volunteers. Everyone was on board. Even like Dad's Army type RFS guys, Rural Fire Service, right down to the young, bright park rangers and the DPI people. They're the biosecurity experts. I was very impressed. You know, there were still cowboys around on one of the sites that my team had to visit on one of the nights. It was an unregistered apiary, and someone had notified the DPI that they noticed these hives there. And the day we turned up to inspect to see what was going on and set them up for eradication, they were gone. And there was a trace of where they'd been. The grass was all squashed down. There was some cinder blocks around. So traces of it and tyre tracks to say that that beekeeper had, in the night before, loaded up his hives and shot through. This is the sort of person that can bring this whole operation unstuck. But I'll tell you now, whoever you are, they're onto you. The investigators are really sharp at tracking down details like this. So, and all the police are notified that if they see trucks with beehives on the back, pull them over, check their paperwork, because commercial beekeepers are the only ones that can move hives, and they've got to register with the DPI that they're doing so to get a permit to do that. And if no permit, they're in trouble. So they'll get you. Disappointing to see people doing that, but you know, these desperados will get caught. And as I've said before, you could face $1 million fine. Are a few boxes of bees really worth that? And if you're a small business or a company, 2.2 million. That's a big risk. All right, I'm going to wind it up there. I don't want to carry on, but if you've got any questions, put them down in the comments below. If this information has been useful for you, give me a thumbs up. Maybe subscribe to my channel or share. All of that helps get the word out. And until next time, this is Mike Allerton from Aussie Mike's Bees, where beekeeping is an obsession.